mom's last rebellion. Well, my mom was raised the only child of a successful immigrant businessman. And they weren't country club set or anything, but country clubs didn't accept immigrants, but they were comfortable. But somehow she fell in love with this handsome farm kid who was dirt poor and hadn't even finished high school because of the Depression. But those snapping blue eyes lured her in and she married him, and they moved to the farm. They didn't even have electricity the first year they were there. Well, in the 50s and 60s, when mom was raising us kids, men were the king of the roost and women were expected to be obedient wives and mothers. Get your kids to church on Sunday and make sure they raise their kids the same. But farm wives had a lot more expectations than other wives. You had to get 3 big meals a day out to dad and all the help in the big family. Mom had this huge garden. She canned probably hundreds of quarts of fruit and vegetables every summer. She raised chickens and ducks for the meat and eggs and actually personally butchered them, 50 chickens and a dozen ducks or more per year. And of course, the biggest job was raising 8 kids in a big Catholic family. Well, obviously, it wasn't an easy life. And sometimes dad didn't help. Dad was very demanding and he angered easily. It was dad's way or the highway. And most of the time, us kids and mom fell into line. He didn't yell, but he was the master of the angry stare or the angry silent pout. Us kids would just run and hide. Well, mom tried to be the good farm wife, and she tried to obey dad sometimes, most of the time. But I don't think she ever got over wanting to move back to town. I think the 2 things that got her through were the love of her children and baking. With 8 kids, a batch of cookies or a cake doesn't last a day, but there was always more. Cakes and pies and cookies, breads, rolls. Mom bought flour in 50-pound bags like bakeries do. Well, as us kids got older, those roles of mother and baker became a little less fulfilling, and mom needed to find something for herself. And she started to buck dad a little bit. One of the first things I remember is how mom, by mistake, voted for McGovern. My dad had been a Kennedy Democrat, but over the years he'd gotten more and more conservative. Well, mom had been home raising kids for 30 years, and one day she goes into town to get a job against dad's strong objection. Well, that only lasted a couple months. Apparently, the arguments weren't worth it. But the biggest surprise was when mom left the church. Dad and mom had been tough Catholics. And the church in her town of Yankton, South Dakota, had gotten too small. So they're going to build a second church in town. Well, that old church is where mom had spent a lot of her life, 65 years. She'd been baptized there. She went to grade school there. She was confirmed there. She was married there, buried her parents there. All of her kids were baptized there. Most of her kids were married there too. And yet an edict came down from the bishop that people that lived over here were all going to go to the new church, and people that lived over here were going to go to the old church. Well, mom was in the new church, and she, at 65, she said, no, She wasn't going to do it. She quit going to church at age 65. So every Sunday, Dad would go to church and Mom would stay home and watch Mass on TV. The hilarious part was that the local station only carried the Mass in Spanish, and Mom didn't understand a word. I don't know if she ever set foot in that new church. Well, time kind of wore people out, and maybe Mom wore Dad out a little bit. And finally, they bought a house in Yankton, in town. It took them 2 or 3 years to actually move there before Dad actually would do it. But he eventually retired from the farm and they moved into town, and Mom had got to shed the role of the farm life and had time to do some activities and stuff she wanted to do, and it was great. Well, that house in Yankton, that was on a hillside, had lots of steps. Mowing the lawn was tough, even for a young person. And when Dad got cancer in 2008, Mom knew that she was not going to be able to take care of Dad and that house. But Dad, of course, refused to move to an assisted living center. They had just built a new one out on the edge of town, and they could get a private apartment there with help for any other needs that they had. Some of Mom's friends were already moved there, and some of her relatives, and they liked it. But every time Mom would bring it up, Dad would go, "Hell no." Well, one day, Mom snuck off to the assisted living center and put a deposit down on the apartment. But she didn't tell Dad, because she knew after 60 years of marriage that when something like this happened that was going to start a fight, she had to find just the right moment to break the news. Well, about a week later, Dad was scheduled for some surgery on his kidneys. And when they opened him up, they found that the cancer mass was so huge that the surgery was no use. And a few days later, his kidneys failed and he died almost immediately. Well, Mom had never gotten around to telling Dad about the new apartment. So after 60 years of marriage, through some lucky but tragic timing, Mom had finally gotten her way.